All right, I'm filling in for Matt, probably through the rest of the quarter. He's on vacation, I think, in Glacier right now, so he's having a great time. We are in Nehemiah 11, if you want to go ahead and turn there. Let me see. Andy, why don't you lead us in prayer while we get started? Amen. One other announcement before we get too far in. I am on call right now for work. Hopefully it's okay. They know I'm teaching, so hopefully they won't give me a call. But if they do, I'll turn it over to Clay and he'll finish however much time we have left. But hopefully that doesn't happen. Yeah. Okay, we're in Nehemiah 11. Once again, Matt has given me the lengthy genealogy. This one's a little less interesting than the last one, though. I really enjoyed the last one a little bit more. All right, what did we cover last Wednesday? Who wants to give me a quick recap? Yeah, the big deal was the signing of the document. Everybody kind of gets together, and there's a big lengthy discourse where most of the leadership stands up. The leadership that is both civic and religious stand up. And in this discourse, what is their main point? It's found in chapter 9. It's like all of chapter 9. Yeah, that's their big deal. They spent the majority of 9 saying, our fathers did terrible stuff, and we're going to start listing a whole bunch of them until we get down to around verse 32 period of chapter 9, and then they start to talk about themselves, and they're making a covenant because God has been faithful to them. So God has kept up his side, we're going to keep up our side, and they're also trying to bind God again to have good things continue to happen to them. They don't go into too much detail, but they talk a lot about we're going to be really good and nice to you, and the land will be blessed, and the land will prosper. So they've got a lot of those health and wealth gospel style thoughts going on here, which is not uncommon, and it's not wrong for them. Read the law. God promised them that if you do this, this will happen. I mean, it's a mathematical equation. You read through the end of Deuteronomy when they're supposed to be shouting blessings and cursings back and forth at each other from the two mountains once they enter the land. That's what God flat out says. You obey me, you're going to get all these blessings. If you disobey me, we're going to start with this curse. If you're still disobeying, we're going to go to this curse, and so forth and so on as you go down the list. And so here we are a few centuries later. It's not unexpected that that's their perspective. If you're wealthy, God loves you. Does that sound familiar? When we get to the New Testament, there's a reason that Sadducees and Pharisees believe they're right. That reason is, I have money and you don't. Therefore, you must be the sinner, I must be right. Kind of falls apart with tax collectors a little bit, but we'll just overlook that, right? We just won't look at that one. But that's what we're talking about here in chapter 9. They've made this covenant. Matt did a good job of talking about the importance of the fact that now they're writing it down. Previously, it was an oral agreement. All the people would say amen. All the people would say yes. All the people would say we will do this. Now they have written down, they've bound themselves legally to be doing this. And so it's a shift. It's a Persian shift taking place there. Then we moved into chapter 10. And in chapter 10, it went into a little bit more specific details. And Matt talked about this last time as well. We got the big long list at the beginning of chapter 10 of everybody who put their name down onto this document. Very Declaration of Independence style. I want to know if one of them was bigger than everybody else, but I don't know. Then we have the rest of the people, verse 28. I love this. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the people of the land to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, enter into the curse and oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. And so we talked last time, and Matt went through the rest of chapter 10 here, how they're making specific promises. They promise to do everything, and then they mention specific things that they're also going to do. Things that are very reminiscent. If you think back to early entering into the land of Canaan, these are the kind of commitments they made. Later, they don't make a lot of these commitments again. One of the biggest ones that they don't really do later is found in verse 30. Of chapter 10. What kind of commitment were they making in chapter 10 and verse 30? Intermarriage. They make that commitment when they first entered the land, and then it goes away. It doesn't appear to be a law of Moses commitment. It appears to be a time-oriented commitment, because we see it happen here again. But we don't see it happen all the time. After all, do you guys believe Boaz was a righteous man who married a Moabitess? You can't get more wrong than marrying a Moabitess. Not only is she not of the Jewish people, but they're specifically mentioned as being evil and don't go near them. So again, we notice this early entering perspective once again. So it's kind of like starting over. A few chapters ago when I taught last time, we talked about the similarities of chapter 8 and Acts chapter 2. That the people are just totally revamping everything they're doing and going back to the way it used to be. So it's a new start. It's kind of like they've just come out of the wilderness, Persia, and now they're home. So we're going to start again. So they're going to make sure that they don't bring in any intermarriages. They're very concerned about keeping the Sabbath, something that they did not do very well about. And they add in that we are going to make sure that we are giving what we're supposed to the functioning of the temple. Anybody got any comments on chapter 10? Okay, now let's talk about what you came to talk about. Chapter 11. So we are, if you have your class books, on page 15, taking a look at chapter 11. Question 1. What do we see happening in Nehemiah 1 and 2? Yeah, you're exactly right. They're going to cast lots to see who is going to be stuck in Jerusalem. Is that the way they talk about it? No, they kind of look at it as an honor, right? The rest of the people bless them. We even have it kind of worded that some of the people even seem to volunteer. The end of verse 2 kind of makes that point, right? The people are blessing all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. So not even those who just had the lot fall on them. But now we've got even more that are wanting to do. Why did they have to do this? Why did they have to cast lots in order to bring people in? What do you guys think? Yeah.
It would be harder to support yourself in a city. You don't have any land. You have to be some sort of a shopkeeper or something like that to support yourself.
I think that's a huge, huge thing. Trade is not really flowing through here right now, right? This is a ruined city just a few months ago. Trade caravans don't tend to go near ruined cities because who lives in ruined cities? Bandits live in ruined cities. So they don't go near them. So now they've got to worry about diverting trade. They need to make themselves a trading mecca once again. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge deal, that these people are really going to be making a sacrifice. These are also some of the people who may be leaving wealth. They may be having lands, having homes out there in the cities, and now they're stuck here in a ruin. Their house is smaller because it's as much as they could put together with the rubble that happened to be around. It's not secure. It's not as safe. It's not as clean. It's not all theirs. They've got neighbors. I mean, can you just imagine moving from the country to now you're moving to the city? Moving from a rural village to now you're moving to the city? It's a whole different culture that they're going to have to deal with as well. So yeah, we see them trying to populate the city by casting lots. What is the percentage? 1 to 10, also known as a tithe. Isn't that interesting? You guys think that's interesting? They tithed themselves and gave it to the city of God. It's a very fascinating, very Jewish way of doing things. I mean, it's like quintessential Judaism right there. How are we going to do it? We're going to do it in the most Jewish way possible. We're going to tithe ourselves. And so it is a sacrifice, right? That's a tithe. End of the book of Leviticus talks about tithes. You take a tithe. When you go through the tithes, you count out 9, and on the 10th one, you take it, whether it's blemished or not. Not something we always talk about. But that means if you're doing a true random lot, you're going to have some very useful people. Blacksmiths, quarry engineers, carpenters, and you're going to have some worthless people, like a leper, because that's a tithe. That is a lot. So the randomness is there. It's a very interesting method of choosing to populate Jerusalem. Any thoughts anybody has in the first 2 verses there? Yeah. They are a target. You are exactly right. And we're going to see a little bit of that probably next week when we get a little later into Nehemiah. Any other thoughts anybody has? Yeah. Yeah. Are they Jews if they don't own the city of David? I mean, really, that's what it comes down to, right? Yeah, okay, we have the law of Moses, we're Abraham's people, but if we don't own the city, if we don't have a temple, who are we? We talked about that way earlier in Nehemiah, and really that's one of the difficulties that Zerubbabel and Ezra dealt with, was who are we if we don't own our city? It's what Nehemiah 1 was talking about. My city is in ruins. My people are cast along everywhere, across the wilderness. Who are we? Okay, any other thoughts before we go a little further? I'm really interested to see what you guys wrote for question 2, because Matt likes or doesn't like genealogies. So yeah, question 2. Basically, he says, what do we see in chapter 11, verse 3 through chapter 12, verse 26? What's going on? Somebody take a crack at it. What do you think's going on? Mm-hmm.
So if you want to go back to your potentially giving up wealth, they're Levites who do not necessarily have any kind of allotment around Jerusalem. So they're giving up their ability to make a living for themselves, or at the very least having to entrust that to somebody else.
Yeah. And I like that you connected it. This is the list of the blessed people. This is the tithe. This is the ones who were chosen by the lots and brought back here. Any other thoughts before I start making a bunch of comments? Because once I get on a roll, you've heard me now a couple of times. You know I don't stop. Okay. Go back with me to verse 3. These are the chiefs of the province who lived in Jerusalem. In the towns of Judah, everyone lived on his own property in their own towns. And notice the breakdown again. I talked about this with the last genealogy. How is the people of Israel broken down during this time period? What are their groups? What's the first group? Verse 3. Israel. Not the name we usually call them after Persia, right? What do we normally call them after Persia? Jews. I heard somebody say it. I don't know. It was this ear that said it. Jews is the normal one. We call them Judah. We might throw a Benjamin in there, but we don't use the word Israel nearly as often. Once we get out of Babylon, we get out of Persia range. And once we get towards Christ, a few centuries later, they're Jews. Israel is like an antique name. It's a very highly formalized name once we get to that point. But notice that's what he says. He says we have Israel. Why does he use the word Israel? Why not the word Judah? Yeah. Because it's all the tribes. And that's so important. We forget sometimes that those northern nations, some came back, but they don't get an inheritance anymore because they don't own the lands of Manasseh. They don't own where Asher was. They don't own these regions. They only really own Judah and one other tribe. What's the other one? Benjamin. Technically, I think they own some of Simeon, but Simeon disappears so fast it's irrelevant to even mention. But Judah and Benjamin, those are the two. And so in this very list, did you catch which two tribes are named? Excluding Levi? It's Judah and Benjamin. Because those are the ones who have an inheritance. The rest of them are homeless. That's why he uses Israel, because they're homeless. They have nowhere else to go. I can almost guarantee that verse 2, all the men who willingly offered themselves, those who volunteered, you're going to have a lot of people from those other tribes. Because they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have any land. They don't have an ancestral plot of land that they can go back to and say, my great-great-great-great-grandfather put this stone here. They don't have it. But that's why they call it Israel. And I made this point last time we went through the genealogy, that from this point forward, that's how they start to think about themselves. They think about themselves as Israel, priests and Levites. So by the time we get over to the New Testament, they know they're a foreign tribe, but it doesn't have a lot of interaction. Do we ever see Paul worried about his ancestral Benjamite lands? Do we ever see anyone in the New Testament coming and saying, I need my ancestral lands? I think only one time is Jesus ever confronted, tell my brother to give me my inheritance. Once. But you go back before the Babylonian captivity, that would have been what the courts are full of. How do we divide up this land when we've got a lot of relatives? Because we have to stay here. They don't have it anymore. Till today, that's how the Jews think of themselves, as we are Israel, priests and Levites. 3 categories. Because once that land property was gone, that was it. So the people are living in the land. We start off here with Israel. We have priests and Levites. We have 2 other categories. What are the last 2 categories? Yeah. Temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants. There's also going to be singers later on. All of this goes back to David and Solomon establishing certain people and certain rules. Well, that family owns it now. It's kind of like how the family of Aaron, God picked Aaron's family, so if you ever see the word priest, you know they're related to Aaron somehow. And if you see the word Levite, they might be related to Aaron or they might not. So that's your distinction. Certain families own it now. We see the sons of Asaph all the time, right? They write a lot of the Psalms. They're mentioned frequently. David and Solomon had a big deal of establishing them. And we're even going to see it in this list that they are mentioned once again. So notice those familial lines. So we start off in verse 4, listing off the sons of Judah. Verse 7 lists off the sons of Benjamin. Verse 10 is the list of the priests. And the priests are broken down a little bit by high priestliness, major priest families, Jediah, Adiah, and where's the last one here? Amashai. Those are the primary ones. Jediah is in verse 10. Adiah is in the middle of verse 12. And Amashai is just after the first line of verse 13 there. They seem to be major families. 2 of them mentioned frequently. Adiah and Amashai are mentioned all over the place from 2 Chronicles onward as being major priest families. Anybody got any thoughts before I go further? Kind of like the family of Annas in the New Testament. Caiaphas and so many of the relatives of that one family owning the high priesthood. It's kind of what we're looking at here. Okay, in verse 15, he talks about the Levites, and he lists all of them down through verse 18 there. All the Levites in the holy city, 284 of them. It lists off the gatekeepers in verse 19. The rest of Israel, the priests, Levites, everybody else, all live in their own towns. Everybody has their own inheritance. Notice again this can I call it foreshadowing? It's like reshadowing. That they did this way back when. Joshua did this. And they're doing it again. The people have entered the land. Who is going to live in the cities? Who is going to have the inheritance? It's like they're redividing. They're reconquering. They're rediscovering themselves. It's very similar to when Israel got their land back in our day and age. They had to rediscover themselves again. Who are we? And that's what they're doing here. Overseer of the Levites is mentioned in verse 22 by name. It is his responsibility for making sure that the Levitical work is done, not the priesthood. This is the supplying of the priesthood. That's his primary thing, in the care of the temple. And the sons of Asaph are mentioned in this list as well as belonging to the singers, who are given responsibility in the work of the house of God. Any comments before we talk about the weird verse 23? Why do I say verse 23 is weird? What do you guys think? That's the question. Nehemiah is so specific, and whoever organized this book is so specific. We've got names of people that are mentioned nowhere else in Scripture. That's specific. And then he just says, the king. Well, it seems to be Artaxerxes. It seems to be who we're referencing. That's what most scholars seem to think, that we're going all the way back to Persia. And I don't see any reason to argue with that, that this is Persia supplying for the work here in Jerusalem. It's a very interesting thing, though, when we start to think about Persia involving themselves. Notice what it says. There's a command from the king, from Artaxerxes, concerning them, and a fixed provision for the singers as every day required. So the Levites and the singers have a specific allotment from the king of Persia. What are some of your thoughts about that? Yeah. Could be. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Not one I encountered very often. Most scholars seem to go Persia route, but I think yours fits much more with the Jewishness of chapter 11. Going from Lots to David does seem to fit. Any other thoughts? Nobody else brave enough? Okay. It's pretty interesting. If it's David, then that's pretty easy. They're just following after the traditions of David. If it's Persia, it's weird. And we do see some interesting things going on there. We know that Nehemiah had a lot of letters from Artaxerxes. This could be one. We also know that Persia has a long history of interacting with the religions of their conquered lands. If you think back all the way to the first Persian king, the most important one to the Jews was Cyrus. He sent them home, right? Why does he send them home? He sends them home to reestablish their own religions. It's a great plan. I mean, we've got a few of his decrees that specifically talk about that. And he did it for all of the captive people of Assyria and Babylon, so that all of the gods of the known world would all like Persia. So again, we might see Artaxerxes doing that. We might see him doing it simply because he likes Nehemiah. I mean, that's always a possibility as well. Or it's David. Take your pick. I like the David idea. It's not as much scholarly support, but I think it fits real nice, doesn't it? It just fits a hole here in this story. Okay, yes. Quoting Andy. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Again, I think if you're taking the David route, it could be a position that David has established. If you're taking the Persia route, then this is somebody who constantly is interacting with Artaxerxes. Again, that may be why scholars are going that direction rather than the David route. I like the David route, but you might be right. Yeah. Any other comments before we go a little further in verse 25? Okay. In verse 25 down through the end of the chapter here, we get a big long list of cities and regions to kind of describe to the reader, this is how big Judah was. And if any of you are lucky enough to have a map in your Bible, you can kind of take a look and see Judah's real small, like real small. Like doesn't even own all the way to the south part of the Dead Sea, kind of small. It talks about Beersheba, and down into that range, but that seems to be a little further than remains under their control. The southern border seems to be around Kiriath Arba, if you guys can find that on your map. And it goes all the way as far east to kind of the plain of Ono, Lod region. That's west, sorry. And it does not cross over the Jordan. I mean, pretty much Jericho, that's it. Not huge at all. I mean, really, when you contrast this, when we look at the smallest portion that the northern nation of Israel had, they still covered more than this territory. So not a lot of range. Any comments anybody has on that? But what is important is that they are a nation. Persia has to deal with them as a nation now. They can't just deal with them as a captive people. They have to respect the authority of their own rulers whom they have elected. They have to respect that they are on the trade route and they are going to be enacting their own tribute, their own tariffs and things of that upon those merchants that are going through. And they have to respect the fact that if these neighboring nations start causing problems, Israel is going to respond. It's going to happen. Now, they may respond by saying, Persia, we need you to respond. But some of these lists, especially, yes, the list that we just went through, some of the times it gives us a number and it calls them men of valor. For example, if you just want to look at one of them, chapter 11 and verse 6. All the sons of Perez who lived in Jerusalem were 468 valiant men. That word is war. I mean, that's what it's talking about. So we're looking at an army, not a massive army. We're not looking at they're not conquering. But if you come in and you start causing problems, Israel is prepared to respond now. Remember last time I taught about the word sovereignty and dominion. They can control their land now. It's them. It's not Jews are living in the land of the Philistines or Jews are living in the land of Syria. No, Jews live in Israel now. So when you're in Israel, you do as the Israelites say and as the Persians say. Notice the local and the federal level. State and federal. Any comments anybody has?
I turned over to Malachi real quick, and just those first few words of verse 2. I have loved you, say the Lord. You say, how have you loved us? We're small. We're nobody.
Yeah.
We're independent per se, but we're still under control of a foreign power. The temple isn't all that big like it used to be. The wall, well, a fox could run up and it might fall down. But you say you love us. How do you love us? And maybe there's a sense here that all this is here because the people need to learn to trust. Yes, you made that covenant in chapter 9. Yes, you confessed your sins. Yes, you've all signed off that we're going to follow the Lord. Now follow me through this hard time.
Yeah. It's a great comment. Anybody else have any thoughts? Okay. Chapter 12. We are still in the list of names. Oh, sorry, I didn't write the book. But in chapter 12, we start off with looking specifically at a certain group. What certain group are we looking at in chapter 12 in the first 26 verses? Yes. We're going all the way back and looking at a history. So, verse 1, these are the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel and with Jeshua. Who is Zerubbabel? Yeah, he's a governor. I think he's mentioned in Matthew 1 too, isn't he? Whose genealogy is in Matthew 1? Thank you, that's right, Jesus. He's in the list of the lineage of Jesus, which by definition would make him related to who else? David. So he is the lineage of David, returning back to the land. Anybody else thinking king? No, he's not king, but he is where the royalty's coming. Can you see that royal line of David coming through here? So that's what we're going back to. He was first. He's before Ezra. So we're looking at, these are the people who came back with him, specifically the priests and the Levites. And the list goes from verse 1 down through verse 11. That is specifically talking about priests and Levites that came along with Zerubbabel. Because then we get a new timetable word or phrase in verse 12. And in the days of, this time it's Joachim, were priests, heads of the fathers' houses, and it gives us a long list down through verse 20. Then in verse 22, in the days of Eliashib. What are we looking at? We're looking at high priests. It seems to be what we're looking at. This is our lineage of priesthood coming down through here. Maybe the lineage of rulers, maybe going off of Zerubbabel and then giving us a list of Levites and priests. It's a little unclear. I couldn't really decide when I read what the history talks about, but it's all there. Any comments anybody has on that? Okay. The over-encompassing verse is verse 26. These were in the days of Joachim, the son of Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and in the days of Nehemiah the governor and of Ezra the priest and scribe. So, we're talking about this is what has happened to get us to where we are now. And the now is verse 27. We have fully established everything. We have a priesthood again. We have a Levitical Levites again. We have the singers. We have the gatekeepers. We have the people. We have people living inside of the city. We have a wall that surrounds the city, and we have people that live in their own villages. Nation. So now they turn their attention to something new. Question number 3. Anybody got any thoughts before we actually get to answer another question? Okay. What's the occasion in verses 27 to 30? Dedication of the wall. What does it mean to dedicate Jewishly? What are they talking about? They're dedicating it to God. That's what they're doing. I mean, we still kind of use that word too. We might dedicate something in someone's honor or something like that. We still have that word. How do they dedicate it? Do they just say, it's God's? It's always a big celebration of some kind, right? Either they're doing a lot of eating or they're not doing any eating. But there's going to be a celebration. You're exactly right. Let's take a look at a few options because I don't know exactly how they do this. I do know that the process goes through certain steps. So we have the dedication of the wall that is about to happen here. What is step 1 to dedicate the wall? Before even that, bring the Levites. Yes, we got to take all the steps, right? You can't eat your cake until you bake it. You got to get all the Levites together. Why aren't they all together? Because they left and went to other towns. What's the role of a Levite? It's to teach the people. So you're going to have Levites out there, so you got to bring them all in. You've got Levites that are working on the temple. We got to bring them all together. We got to get them all ready. That's verse 27 there, right? We bring them together with thanksgiving, with singing, with cymbals, with harps, and with lyres. Step 2, the sons of the singers have to be gathered from all the villages. And then it lists off those villages that they happen to be living in. So now we've got the Levites. We already had the priests because they're in the temple, right? They don't leave Jerusalem. That's where they stay. Levites are the ones spreading out. Singers are the ones spreading out. We've got everybody back together. Now we can use the answer that I got a moment ago. Purification. First step, the priests and the Levites purify themselves, and then they purify the people, the gates, and the wall. How do the priests and the Levites purify themselves? Okay, we got one option. There's the red heifer water. If you remember way back into your Exodus studies, not Leviticus, I think it's Exodus. Sad about that one. They take a red heifer, they burn her all the way down to ash, and then they mix that with water, and then they keep adding water as the years go by. Jewish tradition says they only did 2 heifers or 3 heifers, one of those, until the time of Christ. So in all of that time, they only do it that many times. And yeah, they take the hyssop, they dip it in, and they splash water on you. That's purification number 1. What's another option? Washing of yourselves. Most of these are definitely going to be washing. Priests and Levites, you've got to believe it. They wash themselves. They have nothing unclean on them in any way, shape, or form. Almost all of the sacrifices mentioned in Leviticus or the rituals that priests are supposed to be doing are all starting with, you need to take a bath. So yeah, we're going to have ritual washings. Probably the people did as well, but it's more difficult to prove from the law of Moses. What's another option? We got to get some blood involved. And that's where it starts to be a problem, because I don't know, and nobody else really seems to know. I mean, they kind of write a little bit about it, but we're not really sure how they dedicated it. We know how they purify some things, like we can go back to Leviticus and we can see, what if your house has been made unclean? How do you make it clean again? That kind of sounds like dedicating and purifying, right? It's a long, drawn-out process with a couple of birds, and you kill one, you don't kill the other one, you dip it in blood, and you sprinkle it, and then you let the bloody bird go. It's kind of a long process. There's some sticks involved. So it's a weird one, but that could be. I mean, that's always an option. We could use the same option that they used with the tabernacle. That was utilizing hyssop as well as anointing oil. They could have anointed the gates and the walls that way. The point is, we're not really sure, but it is something. And I wanted us to kind of brainstorm a bit and stretch our law of Moses minds to remember back to some of those options that the Jews have for themselves. But this is new. I don't know, the other times it talks about like Solomon building certain things. He would sacrifice a lot of animals, but not really seeming to be in any particular order or particular way. He just does. So things like that kind of happen, but we don't see a whole lot of dedicating of objects. Any thoughts?
Sure, a whole lot easier now than it was.
You're exactly right. For us today, yeah, pretty much, if you want to give something to God, you give it to God. I mean, it's not a whole bunch of sacrificing. Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things we talked about, whether they're using the red heifer water or they're using the ritual for cleansing of a house that was infected with leprosy or became unclean, or they're utilizing one of the rituals in order to get uncleanness out of the person, because there's a couple of those. I mean, they got options. Which one they used, I don't know, but the point is they did purify. They were concerned about being pure.
This is kind of the completion of Nehemiah's work.
Mm-hmm.
This is why he came to get this wall built.
Yeah.
And I know he does some other things along the way in chapter 13, things like that. But it's in a way Nehemiah is giving all of his work to God and bringing all the people who labored with him to say, let's give this glory to God for this wall. We're not anything special. We're not anything great. He's everything. He enabled us to do it, and so now we dedicate it to him in a way that is honoring to him and that he will be accepted or he will excel. And that's how the purification happens.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Any other thoughts? Okay, let me see if I'm ready for the next question. Yep, question 4, let's talk about that. What happens between verses 31 and 43? What's going on? It's kind of like a worship, and it's kind of like a parade. I'm really glad you said that right then, because that was perfect. It really reminds you of events. It reminds you of David bringing, the tabernacle, and David dancing before the Lord. I mean, that kind of comes to mind when you read this, or Solomon with his long parade of animals coming in, because he sacrificed a ton, several tons, in point of fact, hundreds of tons of animals going through. So we've got all this going on, this parade style. But notice, Nehemiah is pretty specific. I mean, he's organizing it. First of all, who is involved in the actual parade? It's in verse 31. The leaders are involved. And the priests, the two great choirs, That seems to be. Now, we got priests involved as well. After them went Hoshea and half of the leaders and things like that, and some of the priests' sons and so forth and so on, going down from verse 32 down through verse 36. We've got singers involved there. But that seems to be what we're doing here, is we're trying to set up two groups of singing individuals with the leadership involved as well as the singers. Kind of why we had to bring them all in from the countryside, right? There's only like 128 of them, so we're not talking about a ton of people here, even though he calls them the great choirs that are going around. It doesn't appear, at least not as far as I read, you guys can point out if you've got a verse in there, but it doesn't appear that all of the people are walking this. That it's two specific groups separated out that are going to be doing these parades. That's at least what it seems like to me. So, Group 1 is up here from 31 down through verse 37. We've got leadership involved, we've got priests involved, we've got the singers involved, the musical instruments of David, the man of God, are involved. Ezra is with them. Where do they start? Verse 37. They start at the fountain gate, and where do they end? At the water gate. Yeah, I know, they're both water. One is a fountain, one is water. Don't get them mixed up. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about them walking about half the city. That's the point, is they're supposed to be walking the wall. Now, what about the other side? What else is going on? The other choir, verse 38, They gave up things, went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people. I followed them. Who's the I? Nehemiah. So Ezra's with one, Nehemiah's with the other. These are the big names, right? They have books named after them. There's no book Zerubbabel. He's not as important, even though he's in the lineage. Ezra, Nehemiah, they're the ones with names. And so where do they start? Okay. It could be the same place. It could be the Tower of the Ovens, which is kind of nearby. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Where do they end? End of verse 39. The prison gate. The point is that they are supposed to be walking as much of the wall as they possibly can. And singing. Because you've got people everywhere, right? There's a lot of people who live in Jerusalem now. All right. Anybody else have any comments? Then we have a all-encompassing verse. Verse 43. What other great thing was happening this day? Yes, great sacrifices that day were made, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. You can just imagine the roar coming from this dead city. Because that's what it was a few months ago, right? It was a corpse lying on the mountainside, and it has come to life. Does that sound like a prophecy? Does that sound like God doing something here? A resurrection has happened. They have left the wilderness and returned. I mean, all of the symbolism, it's just happening again. When they left Egypt, they died. They came out of death into life. They did that coming out of Persia. They are alive again. The city hums. The city sings. And you can hear it from all over the place. Can you just imagine being in some of those other little towns? Maybe you got left behind because somebody had to stay and keep the ox from breaking out. Maybe that one person per town or a handful of people per town. Maybe you're even further away and you just hear this sound, this haunting sound on the wind. Maybe you're along the Mediterranean coast and you can just barely hear it. But there's life that way now. And you're going to have to deal with it. So again, it comes back to they're a nation. They're sovereign. They are religious. Their religion is uniting. They're a people. Any comments anyone has? I like that it's specific as well, that it says that the women and the children also rejoiced. Don't you guys like that? We don't always get these comments that the women and the children are involved, but here it is. This is a full national day that is happening here. when they have dedicated this wall. They are thrilled and thrilled beyond belief. Any comments before we get into the next question? All right, question 5. 44 through 47, what is arranged? Yeah, we need to make sure that in a month from now, the temple can keep going. Remember, that's kind of one of the problems of having a temple, a physical place where physical things have to happen. You have to keep bringing physical things to it. Can you just imagine the amount of wood that is needed just to keep one of these altars going? And then you've got the incense altar, you've got water. These priests, after each sacrifice, they might be cleaning themselves up a bit before going on to the next one. Ritual cleansings are going on. People coming to the temple are doing ritual cleansing. This is a lot of water. It's not going to take long before this water is so disgusting that you're not getting cleaner by using it. That's kind of the point, is to get the unclean off of you. So you walk through the marketplace, there's unclean on you. Get it off. That's one of its purposes. Well, if the water's unclean, well, it's not going to do any good. So a lot of people need to be involved in bringing in the water. They've got sacrifices that have to happen every single day. These minimum sacrifices have to happen every single day. And you have to have people here at the temple every single day, which means that somebody has to, at the very minimum, bring them something to eat. Right? Some of these sacrifices they get to eat from, but if nobody comes with a peace offering, the rest of those are burnt offerings. I mean, nobody comes with a sin offering to offer today, you're probably not getting fed. So as the people are starting to, get used to this again, it's going to take some time before you're going to have a steady flow of people. Of these wealthier, now poor people who live in Jerusalem. They don't have flocks. So the locals don't have enough to be able to constantly be supplying to the priesthood these sacrifices that they get to eat from. So we need to make sure we have it established. He talks about several things. The storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes needed to be gathered into portions as required by the law for the priests and for the Levites, according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. So we need to make sure that there are storerooms that are actually working storerooms. We've had this problem previously in Nehemiah where it talked about, I think we're going to have it again as well, the storerooms were not being used appropriately. I was thinking, we're going to have a guy thrown out here soon, aren't we? Yeah, I was thinking he was coming up in chapter 13. Yep, chapter 13, living in a storeroom. So that's going to be a big deal here in just a little bit. So we're making sure everything's in place. That the people are bringing in their tithes, as well as they may be going back to a Solomon-esque idea where 1 month per year, certain regions are responsible for supplying to the leadership and supplying to the temple. So they may be going back to some of that with those contributions as well. The first fruits all belong to God. What does that mean? Because it's different than tithing. What does it mean? Could also mean the best, but he separates them. And so I think it's important for us to realize there is a first fruit that belongs to God that you have to buy back if you want to keep it. Tell me about that. This is Leviticus again, I'm sorry. It's my favorite book. Yeah, your child. So you're of Israel and you had a firstborn, belongs to God. You got to buy it back. But not just of humans, of all animals, the firstborn belongs to God. If you want to buy it back, you got to buy it back with another one of its kind plus a fifth, I think, if I remember correctly, or something of that nature. Mentions it at the end of Leviticus. It talks about that, the first fruits. So that's separate than tithing. That's not the same. And sometimes I think we forget that this side of the cross. We forget that those are separate things. So they had to be very concerned with that. The first fruits are coming in, the tithes are coming in. And I talked about the tithes a moment ago. Read the end of Leviticus if you want a little bit more of information about the tithes. That they brought through 9, and whatever the 10th one was that passed under the stick goes to the temple. Any comments anybody has?
It's interesting, this comes on the end of the big celebration.
Yeah.
Because I know they had difficulties getting around the building the temple, finally getting it done. But it's one thing to build a temple. It's another
I think you're exactly right. Last point, verse 47. All in Israel, it says, in the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah, gave daily portions for the singers, the gatekeeper. They set apart was for the Levites set apart for the sons of Aaron. So notice how the tithe worked. Israel tithe to the Levites, Levites tithe to the priesthood. Okay, we'll finish Nehemiah next week and probably do a review the next.